Welcome back to Sometimes Love Isn't Enough, the Parenting Through Challenges podcast. I am your host, Angie Grandt, generational healing specialist. And so in last week's episode, we talked about struggles in raising teenagers. And what we really talked about is what your teenager is going through, what's influencing their behaviors, their disconnection, and perhaps your challenges with really feeling like you understand them. And in this week's episode, what I really want to do is to dig into some practical strategies that you can consider implementing in your home to really meet the needs of teenagers. So if you haven't listened yet to this week's episode, I definitely recommend that you do so because I think that it lays a nice foundation for where your teen is at and really what's going on inside of them energetically. But there's today in this episode, we're going to dig so much more into what really is underneath those behaviors that we talk through things that you can do about it. And I actually want to dig into some human needs, some basic human needs. We've talked about this before in this podcast. We all know the basic needs like clothing, food, shelter, heat. We know that these are things that our kids need, that we need. But as humans, we also have some additional core human needs that when these needs go unmet, it can have such a monumental impact on our behaviors and our kids and on the way that we relate with others and really ultimately the way that we relate with ourselves. I'm also aware that those teenage behaviors that we are experiencing, it can make these unmet behaviors, right? These behaviors can make seeing those needs, those unmet needs, even trickier. So, we're going to go through these needs one by one and then talk about some practical things that you can do to try to reconnect with your teenager, try to meet their needs. So, perhaps in a way that you've not considered before, we're going to look at this need and right because we can see what's on the surface. We our teenagers, they're defiant or they're disrespectful. They might shut themselves out from us where we could go days or even weeks and we feel like we haven't even hardly talked with them or connected with them. And yet underneath the surface of those behaviors can be tricky for us as parents are these needs. So let's talk about the first one. The first need in our teens is a need to feel like they belong. As we were talking about in last week's episode, there's some key energetic things that are happening to our kiddos that can make this sense of belonging flip upside down on its head. So during the teenage years, our kiddos, their crown chakra is closing off, meaning that they're less open to ideas and often less open to ideas, especially from their parents. This is a necessary shift that's happening with our kids as they move towards more independence. But they also have this unbalanced heart chakra, right? Meaning that our kids at this age really need to figure out where they belong, how they belong, how they fit in, which, right, when you think about it, all teenagers are going through the same thing, perhaps at different rates, but they're all just trying to figure out how in the heck do they belong with each other? Where do they belong in their family? How do they fit into their community? And so they're trying to figure out this new skill set with, they don't have any experience. They've never done this before. They they grow up their entire life being part of a family, and now energetically they're designed to not do so. They're designed to figure out where they belong, which is different than being part of a cohesive family, perhaps. So, what do we as parents get to do about that? Well, let's take a step back and think about what we as parents need to feel like we belong. Thinking whether thinking about in our family or maybe your experience at work, one of the key things that we need to feel like we belong is to feel like we're seen and heard. And oftentimes I find myself here time and time again that we do see our teenagers, but what we tend to see is kind of the ugly things with them. We're we're giving them feedback about their misbehavior. We're giving them feedback about things that don't match expectations about how we think they're supposed to behave. And that isn't quite what they need at this stage. They don't need to be told that they're being disrespectful. They don't need to be told that they crossed the line. They already know. Because I imagine, when we're thinking about a 13, 14, 15, 16-year-old, they've been getting feedback their entire life about right from wrong and expected and not expected. Almost like a teenage age when they're really pushing our buttons, when our kids are really engaging those challenging behaviors. It's almost like as parents, we forget that they already know, or we assume that they're making a conscious decision to make our lives miserable. And I trust that they know because they've, been living on this planet for over a decade. And also, I I'm not saying our kids obviously have free will and they can make decisions, but I think take a back and look at kids through this lens of human design, through this lens of what's happening with their energy, this lens of unmet human needs. It gives us this place to maybe take some of the blame off of our kids for being disrespectful or choosing to be defiant and instead be more curious about what they're going through and what that unmet need might be. So, so you think of those bigger things, right? That when we when we think about trying to help our teenagers feel like they belong, do we let our teenagers have a say in big, important family decisions? If you're thinking about moving or maybe redecorating or going on a family trip or doing something big as a family that influences your kids, how much of a say do they get to have it? Do they get an equal voice? Or are they instead told what the family's doing? Because because when we're treating our kids, our teenagers like kids, and we're deciding things for them, it it takes away their sense of belonging. It creates space not really where they fit in. And I do think as I'm describing this example about giving our kids more choice, this also bleeds into one of the other unmet needs. So we'll be talking about that in a minute, but when we pull our teenagers into our decision making, it really can be a powerful way to help our kids see and feel how much they really do belong in the family, how important their voice is, how seen they are for their unique and creative ideas that might be different than the plan that you had. Because we don't really get a ton of influence over what happens in our kids' social circles. Um, but our but we do get to have influence over what's happening in our home. So so at this age, kids are really designed to see the flaws in others, right? And oftentimes our kids really have a hard time because they're frequently seeing the flaws in themselves. So, so when we think about the sense of belonging and trying to fit in and how we support our teenagers and fit the social circles, we get to opportunities. We get to create opportunities to really help our kids. Sometimes we do that by bringing their attention to things that we notice about, maybe how cool it is that their friends reach out to them for advice, or how impressive it is that they were recognized for something by one of their teachers that you saw them working so hard on. We can our kids the value that they bring just for being themselves, not for, you know, being the best or the fastest, but just for being them. It can help empower them in environments outside of our home, in their social circles, at school, maybe as they're working towards getting a job. We have this ability to really support our kids in in really building their sense of belonging. If perhaps for your kiddo, that is one of their unmet needs. All right. So then the next need, the next possible human need that may be a bit or a lot unmet in our teenagers, um, and it can often rear its ugly head, even more so during the teenage years. It creeps up first when our kids are toddlers, and then it does come back up again for really key necessary reasons, but it's this sense of empowerment or feeling empowered or feeling like they have power or influence over what is happening in their life. And, you know, in this episode, we're talking about our teenagers, but I also really encourage you to be going through this parallel process with me as we're talking about your teenagers and their needs, right? First need feeling like second need feeling empowered. I really encourage you to think about yourself. And do you feel a great sense of belonging in your family with, with the dynamics that are happening in your family? And if so, then how can you embody that for your kids to help instill that sense of belonging in them? And if you don't feel like you belong, can what can you do to work on your sense of belonging? What are things that you have control or influence over? And I would ask you the same question about empowerment. Do you feel like you have control or influence over what's happening in your life? And I know in raising a teenager, it for a parent can oftentimes feel like a lack of control. You might feel like you have things kind of under control in your home, and then suddenly your teenager is behavior than you expected or different than they have been, or you feel like nothing that you've done in the past is working anymore, or you feel like there were problems at school before, but now they're spilling over to home or vice versa. As as parents in this role during the teenage years, we can feel a sense of a loss of empowerment at this stage. And and I don't want to lose sight of, right, like we're talking about your kids' need. If our own needs are going unmet, it's kind of that same analogy of like put on your own oxygen mask first. If you are feeling a loss of control in your home, I'm not saying control your kids. That is definitely not the message here. But what I am saying is, what can you do in regards to your mindset? What can you do in regards to taking care of yourself through the lens of human design to make sure that your energetic needs are met? Can you communicate to feel more empowered or to have more influence over what's happening in your home? I'm also well aware that in raising teenagers, that if there is instability in your parenting relationship with your co-parent, that the teenage years can be incredibly hard for two people who were maybe already struggling to stay on the same page with parenting. And so, what can you do? We can't change people. We can influence us, but oftentimes the answer is within and doing the inner work to to enhance or I'm not thinking of the right word, but doing the inner work to really foster your own sense of empowerment before trying to figure out how to help your kids, right? So when I do think about those examples that I did earlier, it does really tie back to that idea of feeling like they belong when we can allow our kids to make important decisions for the family, but it also empowers them, especially when we let our kids make decisions for things that impact them. You know, our kids are telling us, for example, that they're struggling in school. And our response is, well, you have to go to school. But there really are so many options available to kids when it comes to education. So what if kids tell us they struggle if we really took the time to listen to what they're struggling with and we help them make a choice that works for them? Or, oftentimes at this age, they want things. They need money to buy those things. It can be very empowering for our kids to have opportunities to earn their own money and then to have the freedom to learn how to save and spend at this age. How empowering for our kids to see and believe that they have a voice over what's happening in their own lives. So again, I encourage you to think about what are some really day-to-day routine things that you can do to not only notice if your kiddo seems like they're trying, right? So here's a key sign that you know that your child's sense of empowerment may be damaged or they're struggling with feeling empowered. That most often we see empowerment struggles come out as someone trying to control everything. So if your teenager is trying to control everything, they're trying to overpower, they're trying to take charge, that should be a key signal to you that they're struggling with believing and seeing they have influence in their own life. So what can you do in your home? I'm not here to tell you how to do that, but rather to open your eyes to look at those behaviors through a different lens and then approach it differently. Because I know in working with family after family after family, when our kids are acting out in these teenage years, we react. And really taking that pause and taking a step back, asking us and looking with more curiosity at kids to say, like, okay, yep, what they said right now was, yeah, not my favorite. And it was insulting or rude or disrespectful or hurtful. But what's really underneath those words? Are they feeling like they don't have any influence for what's happening in their life? Is it that they don't feel like they belong anywhere and they're really struggling with that sense of belonging? What is it that you think, see, or, trust your gut, right? Like, what is your gut telling you about where your kiddo is stuck? And start there. Don't start at addressing the behavior problem because it's just a surface thing, a surface side effect to an unmet need. So when so so I guess I'll just leave it at that with empowerment, that reflect on your own sense of empowerment and then how can you tie that to supporting your kiddos, right? Think about what works for you and then what you know about your kiddo. What can you do to support their sense of empowerment? All right. So then the third human need that I want to chat about is feeling valued or feeling worthy. In our current society, we often tie our to numbers, whether it's how much money you make or how much money you have in your bank account or what size of clothing that you wear or how fast you are or what grade you got on your paper, right? We often tie our value to some type of numerical value. And our kids see that. And our kids learn this from us. They learn this from society, how to associate value with some external. And yet, I believe in, I don't get to decide this for you, obviously, but I'm sharing with you that my belief is that our kids and ourselves and all humans are innately valuable simply because we exist. We're each designed to bring something beautiful to the world. And why not we, share old stories and tap into what we're here to do, that each and every one of us is unique. And we, even when our kids are covered in behaviors, that even when that's all that we see, our kids are innately valuable just because they exist. Whether or not we share what our gifts are with others, we're still valuable. I think even, when I first started really learning about human design and working with the mentor that I'm working with now, I I think, growing up, it was almost easy to see that some people were gifted, and these are words that are used in society, right? Some people are gifted and some people are not. Some people are academically gifted, they're athletically gifted, they're, mathematically gifted, whatever it might be. And when we put our kids into these buckets of either you have gifts or you don't, we're missing that every human has something to offer. At least that's what I believe. And sometimes some humans, what they have to offer is help us see ourselves better. Sometimes people in our lives that the anger that it creates in us isn't because they made us angry. It's because they were being them and it triggered a feeling in us, which helps us see ourselves better. But each person's gift is so incredibly unique. And it's not my place or your place to decide what that thing is. But my point being, like I kind of fun it, but my point being is when we teach our kids through our actions, through our words, through our behaviors, that they're only valuable if they produce something or get a certain grade or get a certain score or, you know, whatever that external thing is, they lose sight with finding value within, finding value with who they are, and they get to be in relationships, who they get to be in caring for themselves. So, do we base our kids, do we base our kids' value on how respectful they are being to us? Do we base our kids' value on how good of grades that they're getting or how many hours at the job, really they rank sports? Are we assigning numerical values to our kids? To our kids, when that's how we're valuing our kids, then how are they supposed to learn how to see their internal value? How are they supposed to know that they matter if they perhaps go from being A student to suddenly B's at school? If they tied all of their value to something external and something happened, maybe they were distracted or dealing with anxiety or bullying, or there's a teacher that doesn't like them, or a teacher who is on a mission to, prove that not everybody gets an A, right? These are all things that happen to our kids and so much worse. And if we've taught our kids that their value is tied to something outside them, something they don't have such control over, then that sense of value and self-worth can so easily crumble. And so when I when I'm thinking about how how to help our kids with self-worth, again, I think that first it requires us to take a look back at ourselves. And are we tying our own value to our clothing size, how much money we have in the bank, to whether or not we're keeping up with the neighbors, how new our car is, or whatever it might be? Are we tying our value to external things as opposed to tying our value to just being a good human, being kind, being loving, being creative, right? We yet to do this ourselves becomes incredibly hard to support our kids with this. And yet as parents, this is something that drives us nuts, right? Like why I have thought this and said this and have listened to parent after parent after parent say like, why are they so hard on themselves? Why are they so upset about not getting an A? Or why can't they be okay with making mistakes? Well, I think parents hard pill to swallow, but taking that look back at ourselves and really reflecting on not beating ourselves up for what we've done in the past, but really saying, what can I do moving forward to help my kiddo see that my value is not tied to something outside of me? How can we do that for ourselves so that we can model that skill for our kids so that they can start seeing into as well? I know that this is probably a bit less practical and maybe a bit more reflective, but when thinking about how to support our kids in fulfilling this unmet need, perhaps it does require us to reassess ourselves and to be more curious about ourselves. If our definition of value is outside, then perhaps it's time to reconsider our definition of value and really helping our kids see that they matter just for being their freaking unique selves, that nobody else in this world could ever possibly be like them. And really help kids see that, I think, requires us to start seeing that in ourselves. When we're putting ourselves down, using negative words about ourselves, saying, negative self-talk about ourselves, right? Our kids hear every word. Even when we think our teenagers aren't listening, they've been listening since they started to comprehend language. And that doesn't change when our kids are teenagers. Maybe they hear less of it because they have headphones on or they're at home or hiding in the room, but they'll hear your words. So doing that work on ourselves and really building up our own self-worth is key to supporting our kids with this unmet need. And we know what this looks like in our kids because it is a mirror of what we're often doing. It's our kids talking down on themselves. It's our kids um, beating themselves up or striving for perfection and never really quite getting there because perfection is impossible. It when our kids get at them for making mistakes instead of seeing that mistakes are a necessary part of the learning process, that helping our kids see that some of the most amazing, probably many of the most, if not all of the most amazing inventions that we interact with every day, they weren't figured out on the first time. Some of them, I don't know, don't quote me on this. I know I'm putting this, in some permanent record in my podcast, but, bulb, I don't, took 300 tries before it worked the way they wanted to, or something like that. Don't quote me on the 300. I'm not here to share research or history, but just that idea that when we teach our kids to really see value in themselves, not for getting it right, not for, getting that thing, that's when we really start to see change in our kids and can connect with them more deeply. All right. So last but not least, and sometimes the very hardest of all, is lovability. So I know in my heart that as parents, most of us can say that, well, at least I hope if you're here listening to my podcast, you've made it this far into this episode. This one's longer than maybe some of my more recent ones. That I think that I feel confident in saying that as a listener to my podcast, you love your kiddos unconditionally. But I know in my parenting that my heart loved my kids unconditionally. My mind had so many conditions on them. My mind had expectations of how they should behave, how they should love me back. And when my expectations were not reciprocated, my love changed for them. And I'm not saying that I stopped loving them, but I know, for example, with my son, who came to our relationship with challenges with connection, when my love toward him was rejected and pushed back and shut out and verbally denied, I put a wall around my heart, which essentially, right, I get it. I I needed to protect myself, or I was trying to protect myself from being hurt, but I can't honestly say that I loved him unconditionally because when my love was met with rejection, my 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 condition on him was that I could love him openly as long as he could love me back. And he really just wasn't capable at the time. And so I put up a wall and I became stoic and I was still kind and compassionate, but not in the loving way that he really needed me to be. And I'm not saying that that's you, but I think that as parents, we all have our limit. We all have our trigger. The thing that we can love our kids and meet them with unconditional love until they do that thing, like they they threaten you or they threaten to hurt somebody else in the family or they threaten to hurt themselves or they break that precious family heirloom or they, I don't know, put a crowbar through your windshield of your car, right? We all have that limit and ours are all so different, but we all have things we're okay until. And so when our kids become teenagers and behaviors get ugly, I really encourage you to check in with yourself. Has has the way that your kids perceive your love changed based on how their behavior has changed? Because if your reaction to your kiddos has changed in parallel with their behavior change, then perhaps this is where you start to show up for your kiddos in a different way. And I know it will be awkward and it'll be uncomfortable, and parts of you will fight against it because your reaction to your kiddos is a nervous system protection response. It isn't, I mean, it's fueled by your mind and your expectations and your beliefs about how kids should behave, and also based on a deeply rooted nervous system fear of our kids being out of control, a fear of there being chaos that could compromise the safety of your family. Our reactions to our kids isn't well thought out, like once they, make a threat, then I'm going to lose my cool, right? That's never how it works. What really happens, there's that thing that hits our system right and we react in a big way that sends a message to our kiddo that, oh, when I'm misbehaving, then love is withdrawn. Then things change in our relationship. Then I feel less connected because I made a mistake. I said something that I didn't mean to say, but my hormones, my open crown chakra, whatever it might be, I mean, closed chakra, right? Whatever it might be, triggered this behavior in our kids, and we react to that. So, what would happen if when your kid said the most atrocious, ugly, rude, disrespectful thing, you simply repeated in your head, he just wants my love. And he hasn't quite figured out this stage of his life how to do that. What would happen if you repeated something like that to yourself? That was a long phrase. I would suggest if you're really heated, take the meditation that I shared with you in the last episode. And when you're ready, repeat to yourself something along the lines of, he just wants my love. He just wants my love. He hasn't figured this out yet, and neither have I. And that's okay, right? You get to figure this out together. But far too often, our reactions to our kids' deep, deep need for lovability, right? I started saying in last week's episode and then started out this episode with this again, is that our teenagers' behaviors are doing everything to push us away. And yet it is at this time that our kids need us the most. They need to know that they still belong in a family. They need to know that they have power over what's happening in their life, influence over what's in their kids need to know that they are valuable even when they screw up, even when they do something atrocious. They need to know that they're valuable even when there are things that they were doing so well before are harder now. And our kids at this stage, more than ever, need to know that they are loved and lovable no matter what ridiculous thing they say or do. Those are those deep needs. When we, for teenagers, can instill these things in their nervous system, and we can really help meet our kids where they're at this stage, this is what will carry into them when they become adults. I I find all too often that parents, I was right there too, so I'm not blaming anybody, right? It is a fear-based response, but many of my decisions as a parent when behaviors were so tricky in my home were based on fear, what son's would look like as an adult. But I had no idea. I couldn't predict the future. I just had this fear that if he continues to act this way now at 5 or 10 or 15 years old, I had this fear of this horrible future for him. I had this fear, and that fear of the future that I, it wasn't true. It wasn't true yet because we weren't there yet. But that fear of the future created behavior in present. And that's not fair to our kids. It's certainly not fair to ourselves. My gosh, we drive ourselves nuts and wear down on our nervous system because we're so afraid of how things might turn out. But we don't control that. We do have influence over that. And our fear-based reactions push our kids in that direction versus really tapping into these human needs that all of our kids have, has the power to influence our in a different direction. So when you can, reflecting back on the meditation that I walked you through in the last episode and pulling that in here, right? When you can create a place of coherence in your heart, that there's a connection, that coherence, heart coherence means that what is happening in your heart matches what's happening in your brain. That coherence, right? Because often what happens is we love our kids and we love them so much, and our mind is full of fear and worry and then expectations and unmet expectations, and then we react because there's a lack of coherence between the two. So when we can create that coherence where we can really start to believe that when we can meet our kids' unmet human needs, really assess what is going on there, meet their needs where they're at, work on that state of coherence yourself, make sure your own needs are met. That's when we can shift the trajectory for our kids, for our relationship, because our kids deserve that from us, and you deserve that. So I would love to hear your thoughts about this approach of looking at your kiddos through these teenage years and approaching them differently. These are not reactive strategies in the moment when our kids react. In the last first one was, right? The meditation from last week's episode and the having a mantra in the moment, definitely more of a reactive strategy. But the rest are really preparing your mind to show up for your kids in a totally different way at a time when they need you more than ever, despite what their behaviors are telling you, right? Our kids' behaviors, our teenagers' behaviors are saying, get the heck away from me. I don't need any more. I'm a teenager in my life, right? I know that that's what their behaviors are saying. And I know that developmentally, your kids need you more now at this stage than they ever really have. So I can't wait to hear your thoughts about this episode. Send me an email, find me on social media, and when you are ready to start making these changes for your family, if you need some support, this is the what I love doing with families is how to assess where you're at, assess where your kiddos are at, use human design to help you to understand your kids' energetic needs and your own. I don't, I, I put so much focus on the parents, right? About meeting your own needs, making sure that you are in a place so that you can use these tools when you need to, as opposed to trying to implement a tool when you yourself regulate and you are on minds. So this is the work I love doing. If you're interested in chatting further, I have the link below to schedule action clarity call where totally pressure free. Pressure is not my jam. But I can walk you through an exercise to really see yourselves and your kiddos through a different lens. So until next time, be well.